Hey there, everyone. Mychal, Bryan here from the Oraculos School of Astrology with yet another question and answer segment where practicing astrologers bring me their questions and I provide them answers based on my astrological practice. If you're enjoying these Q&A segments and you'd like to work with either myself or an OSA certified astrologer, then by all means check out our website where you can book yourself a high-quality astrological consultation today. And if you'd like to become a professional astrologer, then check out our Professional Astrologers Diploma Program as well as our Medical Astrologers Diploma Program by visiting the education page of our website.
If a planet is contra-parallel by declination, but conjunct, do you view it differently? Like, what do you put more emphasis on?
The question is if the planets have one relationship by declination, say parallel or contra-parallel with each other, but they have another relationship in terms of zodiacal longitude, which one of those relationships do we place more emphasis on? Because traditional astrology is built within a zodiacal framework, my first emphasis in terms of how planets are interacting with each other is always going to be how those planets are interacting with each other within the zodiac. And anything else I might say about them from a declination perspective will only further amplify the fact that those planets are really interacting with each other. However, truthfully, the buck can stop at just talking about the planets and their zodiacal relationship. And this goes to a larger topic, and that larger topic is the fact that at the Oraculos School of Astrology, we distinguish between planets having specific signification based on the houses they rule, and planets having a universal signification based on what those planets represent universally. So, a specific signification of a planet can be a particular planet being the ruler of the first house, the second house, the third house, the fourth house, all throughout the 12 houses. I want to know how planets are interacting in the zodiac because that's going to tell me how the houses they rule and how the topics of those houses are interacting with each other. That is one very specific type of interaction, which is very different from how planets are interacting with each other based on declination. So, if I have a story being established because I have the ruler of the first house in a square relationship with the ruler of the fourth house in a given chart, and I see those two planets also having a conjunction by declination, which is known as a parallel, or an opposition by declination, which is known as a contra-parallel. Whatever their story is in declination has nothing to do with the topics of the houses they rule from a traditional perspective. So we have to be able to draw a very clear line in our consciousness. When we are speaking about declination, we are no longer within the specific framework of traditional astrology where planets are the rulers of houses and therefore planets rule the various topics of those houses within a person's chart. When we are speaking about declination, we are only speaking about what those planets represent from a universal perspective, which is very different from what those planets represent based on a traditional framework where those planets can be the rulers of houses. This is extraordinarily important to know because as a result of knowing it, we realize that we don't have to wonder about what to do with the planets when they're having one zodiac-based relationship, but their declination is something different. Because the zodiac-based relationship of those planets is going to specifically give us information about the houses those planets are ruling. Whereas the declination-based relationship of those planets is going to give us relationship based on what those planets represent from a universal perspective. Now, for example, say that someone has Venus in a trine relationship with Saturn in their natal chart, and they have Venus ruling the second house, Saturn ruling the 10th house. In a chart such as that, we can say that that person is having a very good feedback loop between the career that they are doing and the money that they have in their life in general. So their career could be a benefit to their money, and their money can be very greatly supportive of their career. Who knows? Maybe they're working for themselves and they're gaining a lot of money from their entrepreneurial work, but they're also being able to invest a lot of money back into their career. So we see a positive feedback loop between the ruler of the second house and the ruler of the 10th house, being the Venus and the Saturn. Now, suppose by declination that Venus and that Saturn are in a contra-parallel relationship with each other. That has nothing at all to do with what we just said about the Venus and the Saturn previously being in the trine relationship as the ruler of the second and the ruler of the 10th house, respectively. Because when we are in the world of declination, we are no longer in a world of rulership. And since we're no longer in the world of rulership, the contra-parallel between the Venus and the Saturn is only going to indicate or speak about the very specific fact that, universally speaking, the things that Venus rules and the things that Saturn rules are coming into a dynamic relationship with each other. And Venus rules love and Saturn rules separation. So Venus-Saturn contra-parallel or Venus-Saturn parallel could be an indication of separation in love. This has nothing to do with what we said earlier about the ruler of the second house and the ruler of the 10th house. Same planets, different framework. And if we're looking at the planets from the perspective of declination, we are not also looking at those planets from the perspective of the houses that they rule. This is a topic that a lot of people tend to get a little bit confused with in astrology, because when we're looking at a chart, we're looking at multiple realities superimposed onto the very limited framework of the planets in the chart, the houses in that chart, the Arabic parts we might be using, the moon's nodes. But even if we're using every Arabic part in the sky, we're still going to have a limited palette with which to paint every reality of a person's life. And so it gets very confusing when we hear that we can use that Venus and Saturn in one way in the declination, and that we can use the Venus and Saturn in another way based on the houses they rule, and that nigh in the twain shall they meet. However, that is exactly how we have to think about it. For those of us who are going to be using traditional astrology and non-traditional techniques, such as myself at the Oraculos School of Astrology, we practice very traditional astrology, but we also practice Uranian astrology and cosmobiology, and the declination table is also something we use. The mundane aspects, the parans, is something we use on a device called the polar azimuthal. So the point is that if we're going to be using traditional astrology, we have to know where the end of that traditional conversation is and where the beginning of the non-traditional conversation is. And that means that if we're talking about planets from a traditional perspective, we're more than likely talking about those planets based on the houses they are ruling within a chart. And once we talk about that, that's it. If we go to the declination table or the midpoints or the polar azimuthal or any other system of astrology that does not take into consideration house rulership, we have to divest ourselves completely of that part of ourselves that is completely bound to these traditional notions of house rulership and essential dignity and debility and accidental fortitude and debility and reception and mutual reception. We have to let those concepts go. Because if we're working in a non-traditional framework, traditional rules cannot and should not and will not apply. So if in your chart you have the ruler of the first house in a trine relationship with the ruler of the seventh house, but if by declination the ruler of your first house and the ruler of your seventh house are in a contra-parallel and therefore an oppositional relationship with each other, that is of no importance to you whatsoever in terms of talking about the harmonious relationship that exists between you and your partner. Because the harmonious relationship that exists between you and your partner is going to be because you have the ruler of the first house and the ruler of the seventh house in a trine relationship with each other. If that is, for example, Cancer on the first house cusp, Capricorn on the seventh house cusp, then that would be the moon in the trine relationship with Saturn. If conversely, on the declination table, you have Moon in a contra-parallel relationship with Saturn, that is only going to talk to you about the complicated relationships you had with your mother growing up. It isn't going to say anything about your relationship, even though that same Moon and Saturn, when placed in a traditional framework, is going to be the ruler of the first house and the ruler of the seventh house, and therefore directly indicative of your relationship dynamics. When we leave that realm of the 12 houses alone and jump into the realm of declination, that moon becomes completely cleansed of any house-based relationship she has in your chart, and the Saturn becomes completely cleansed of whatever house-based relationship he has in your chart. And at that point, we are only talking about Moon and Saturn on their own terms, whereas when we put them back in your chart, we're talking about them based on the houses they rule. We have to cover a clear line between these things so that they do not meld in the middle, because there is no place for them to meld in the middle, because declination is not anti-zodiacal, but declination is non-zodiacal. Therefore, we cannot place a zodiac-based concept, such as the 12 houses, onto the declination table because it doesn't have space for it. Do you know that you can now get daily astrological updates by following us on TikTok and Instagram? Follow us at Oraculos Astrology on both TikTok and Instagram to keep your finger on the pulse of the astrology of the day every day.